All right, Nicholas. So here we are. Another day, another episode, my friend. Do you know what I did the other day, though?
What?
Read a book. You believe it?
Mentioned that was a birthday card. It was a birthday card that you read.
No, man.
It took me 4 days. It took me 4 days to read it.
So, to rewind a little bit and explain what happened here, I way before Christmas, actually, I think it was back in November, I saw that this book was coming out, and it was called Peat and Whisky. It went into the
Peat and Whisky or Peeing Whisky?
No, Peat and Whisky. I think Peat and Whisky is probably the drunk book that you've read, mate.
Yeah, it is.
No, it's
Wrote,
called Peat and Whisky, written by a guy called Mike Billet, and it really caught my attention because Mike's a big whiskey fan. He's also a geologist. He's a scientist, way cleverer than us when it comes to all this stuff. So I thought that'd be really cool to read this book and see this insight. And peat is a big hot topic right now, both with regards to how it affects whiskey, also the sustainability aspect of peat as well within the world that we live in. So we decided to have an interview way before Christmas, just as the book was coming out. Unfortunately, he was so busy, he kind of pushed off till now, which was great because it actually gave me the chance to read this book. And we're going to talk about this in the interview that I did with Mike, but incredible book. Like I recommend any kind of whiskey geek out there to go out and find this book because it goes into, I suppose it gives you a different angle when looking at whiskey that you don't normally get from other whiskey authors. So here it is in its entirety, my sit down with Mike Billet, the author of Peat and Whisky. Today's guest is a maestro of the worlds of science and whiskey. Not only is he a seasoned whiskey connoisseur, but he's a leading peatland scientist with a career that spans 4 decades. With a background in geology, soil, and water science, he's left his mark at prestigious institutions like the Universities of Edinburgh and Stirling and the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Throughout his illustrious career, he's been on a quest not just for the perfect dram, but also to unveil the secrets of peatlands across the British Isles, Scandinavia, and the Arctic. His expertise delves into water quality, carbon dynamics, peatland management, and environmental change, resulting in numerous research papers, book chapters, reports, and articles. But the cool thing about Mike is that he's seamlessly blended his scientific prowess with the art of single malt appreciation in recent years, immersing himself in the landscapes, tastes, and qualities of Scotland's whiskey. So much so that he wrote a book on it. Peat and Whisky, The Unbreakable Bond is not just his first non-academic book. It's a journey from the lab to the lush peat-laden fields of Scotch. Mr. Mike Billet, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for being here. Did you like that intro? Did you like that little hype up for you?
That was fabulous, mate. Just carry on, we can do this for half an hour. Thanks for the invitation and great to speak to you.
Yeah, great to have you here. Thank you so much for your time. Like I mentioned to you before this interview, I loved your book, man. I've got it right here. So there we go. Just to prove to you that I did buy it and I did read it. It was great. I actually spent a little bit of time, quite a bit of time reading this over the Christmas period, the New Year period. My co-host Nicholas, he was going to go and read it, but when he found out that there were more words than pictures in it, it kind of put him off a little bit. So he didn't quite get there with it. So hence the reason I'm doing the interview with you today. But, for me, the great thing was the book delved into subjects that I'd never or heard an author touch on before. And it was done in a really interesting way. And I really enjoyed thinking about the relationship with peat and whiskey in a way that I'd never really thought about it before, which I'm assuming was one of the aspects of why you wanted to write this book, which is what we're going to get into in just a second. But I want to start really basic here, Mike. I've just landed from Mars. I've never heard of peat before. Explain it to me.
Yeah, I mean, peat is a soil. Let's start off with that simple fact. It's and actually it's a very wet soil. It contains about 90% water. When it's dried and used as distillery peat, that goes down to 50% water. But it's basically an amazing source of fuel so it's very carbon rich. And it's also a fabulous store of atmospheric carbon. And that's one of the reasons it's in focus at the moment. It occurs on all 7 continents of the world, not just in Scotland. I mean, Scotland's rich in peat. We have about 20% peat in Scotland. I mean, we have a national drink. I should start a campaign, peat being our national soil. But it's a big part of our landscape, and it's a very important part of our kind of ecosystem and our landscape. And people have basically changed their attitude towards peat over the years. We used to sort of use it and abuse it, shall we say. Mm-hmm. It was perceived as a barren land, a wasteland often that had to be utilized in some way. But now, with the climate emergency, people are very focused on peat and also the lands of peat as well. And that's one of the things that I've been working on. So chemically, it's carbon rich. It's made up of partially decomposed plants. And those plants vary from peat bog to east coast to west coast of Scotland, from continent to continent. And those partially decomposed plants basically will accumulate over time. If you've got wet places, if you've got a reasonable amount of vegetation growth, over the years, the peat will gradually thicken from a few centimeters to meters. Some of our peatlands in Scotland are 10 meters thick. And they started forming at the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago. And these sort of unique landscapes now are very much part of our focus as climate scientists, if you like. And there's a lot of interest in their restoration and their preservation. And I think that's why it's such a hot topic, Mitch, at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I when I was scrolling through Instagram the other day, I actually saw this guy there was a video of a guy who basically had this huge slab of peat in his garden. He was just cutting it out. And it was interesting for me because, the comment was obviously one that was quite leading and wanted people to respond on it. And it basically just said, oh, what do you think of this guy? This is how he fuels his house. And there was a load of people saying, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this anymore. But then there was some people, obviously, you're going to get those people that say, oh, we've been doing this for centuries. It's absolutely fine. Like, don't listen to all the scientists out there that are talking about this being bad. What would you say to someone like that right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's scaled back hugely. I mean, it was hugely important as a fuel source in Ireland for many years. It was harvested in industrial scales in Finland, in Ireland, and also in the former Soviet Union. And it was seen as a fossil fuel, quite simply, like oil and gas. I mean, I would argue, and I do in the book, that you can't consider peat as a fossil fuel. It's a soil. It takes, it grows about 1 millimeter a year. Oil and gas take, and coal take hundreds of thousands, millions of years to grow back again. So it's used very occasionally in Scotland. It's a big part of the culture of the Western Isles. If you go to places like Lewis and Harris, it's a big part of that. And it's done at such a small scale that in terms of peat cutting, it's not going to have a major impact. And I think as peatland scientists, we often, are challenged by exactly this question. But peat cutting or peat extraction in the UK is now less than just a few percent. The big issue is horticultural use of peat, and there's a lot of discussion at the moment and governmental interest in banning the sale of peat, which may well happen in 2024. But as a scientist, as a peatland and climate scientist, what really kind of worries us are all the other things that damage peatlands. Climate change, for example, warming of the atmosphere, huge rainfall events, erosion events. And if you look at things like fire in Scotland or on heathlands, if you look at overgrazing, if you look at the damage caused by erosion, these things are huge compared to the amounts of peat that are actually extracted or used locally. I mean, I've got a very similar question, I have to say, when I was in Lewis talking about peat and, should we continue to dig our peats in the way we've always done? I couldn't go to the island of Lewis and tell them about peat. That's the last thing I was going to do.
Yeah, exactly. I've been there. They wouldn't want that.
No.
100%. I think one of the intriguing stats that you put in your book here, you talk about Lower Pitt Sligo, which isn't too far away from where I am up in Speyside right now, and obviously Port Ellen being the kind of major parts where peat is dug up for the whiskey industry. And I think you estimate approximately 5,000 tons a year is dug up for whiskey. Am I right in saying that's round about the stat?
Yeah, around a little bit more than that, 6,000 to 7,000 tons of peat a year are used by the whiskey industry. People, it depends what data sources, but I did that basically by talking to people, talking to the Northern Peat and Moss Company out there at New Peat Sligo. And of course, the amounts that are dug up now compared to the past are minuscule. If you go back 200, 150 years ago, the amounts were absolutely enormous when you start to dig in to some of the archives. So there's been a gradual step down in, peat use by the whiskey industry, but it's, one of the fascinating things, and one of the reasons I wrote this book is that peat has been an ever-present part of the Scotch whiskey industry for, more than 400 years, in reality.
Yeah.
So the book is very much a celebration of this relationship, but also, facing up to the issues in the future in relation to restoration and sustainability. And, the big question everybody's asking is, should we be continuing to use peat?
Well, I mean, and I want to get on to that, but I want to rewind just a second. I thought that was fascinating in the book. You mentioned it there. The amount that we used to use is huge compared to what we use now. And I think you quoted in the book that you look back on records and it was closer to 36,000 tons we were using per year at one point.
Yeah, I mean, when you, I don't know if you got the numbers in front of you, Mitch, but it was, if you go back, now we're using, we've got a number of sites, probably 7 or 8 in Scotland, but if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, for example, end of the 19th, you're looking at, many distilleries, probably 60 or 70 peat cutting bogs in Scotland. And they were using, up to, 1,000 tons of dry peat a year. So you just sort of do the numbers, the back of the envelope calculation, you come up with some quite big numbers. And if you go back even further, and one of the fascinating records I came across in the book was at the Bunnahabhain peat books. And, for the whole period that Bunnahabhain was peated, you can read about the amounts of peat that were extracted, and they were astronomical at one stage, 2,500 tons a year, just for one distillery. I mean, it's hard to believe that. It's hard to believe the amount of labor and intensity that had to go on a peat bog to extract that amount of peat. But, that was pretty much, if you're on the West Coast, that's pretty much the only fuel in town.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, you look back, in a way, people talk about the fact that we don't have floor maltings, being a bad thing now, and we've gone away from that tradition, but that must have taken so much more peat use. So from an environmental aspect, I suppose it's quite a good thing that we've moved to this more industrial style maltings now, because they are arguably a little bit more environmentally friendly, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there are issues about how you actually cut the peat, so the big maltings like the big peat extraction sites like Castle Hill and Aberdeenshire sites were using industrial sort of harvesting methods, whereas the smaller bogs would be hand cut. So there are, people that would like to see a return to that more, if you like, environmentally friendly small scale. But there is a strong argument, Mitch, to suggest that if you have a smaller number of large peat harvesting areas, you can actually control them much more effectively centrally, in terms of environmental legislation. So, for example, the Northern Peat and Moss Company have quite a strict aftercare arrangement with the regulatory authorities, and that involves, replacing the vegetation, bringing the carbon back, getting the peat going again, and after they step away from that. So, arguably, rather than have 60 or 70 small peat bogs, which are hard to regulate, you could argue, and some people do argue, that it's better to have a small number of large ones.
Terroir and peat. This is a fact, that peat is made up from different materials, and that's something you go into in the book, which I love, because I that's my jam right now. I love talking about this whole terroir conversation within peat. I know our listeners would love to get your views on it. So how can different peat types affect the flavor of the whiskey, in your opinion? How does that happen?
Yeah, this is the I mean, there's a chapter in the book which I call "Every Peat Has Its Own Smoke." And I deliberately didn't use the word terroir, because as soon as you mention terroir, everybody just explodes. But as you know, it's quite a divisive subject. It's quite I would say, quite a bastardized word in many ways. But yeah, and how does peat affect terroir? There's no doubt that different peatlands with different types of vegetation, different plants will produce potentially different flavors in whiskey. And that's just not from bog to bog, but also if you go down the peat profile, if you go to 3 or 4 meters down in the peat, you've probably got different types of vegetation that originally were there and are preserved within the bog. But certainly if you look at Orkney peat, if you look at Highland peat, if you look at Isla peat, there are different plants there. So, hence the title, "Every peat has its own smoke." But I think the big question is what happens when you give that peated malt to a distiller. How can you manipulate or change the actual flavor profile? So, so what you can effectively do is to, if you like, enhance some of the peaty flavors or some of the phenolics in peat by a particular distillation regime. And so the big question to me about, does terroir exist in whiskey? I think you can show that it does exist in new make spirit, distilled in a certain way. And certain people have, there's scientific research to show that. But, after 10 years in a cask, 15 years in a cask, even 6 years in a cask, can you detect those subtle flavors? And, I think that's still to be shown. But certainly, if you go outside the UK and, the book's called Peat and Whisky, The Unbreakable Bond. Well, obviously we're talking about it a lot in the United Kingdom, but you go to New Zealand, you go to Seattle now, you've got local peatlands that are now being used to make whiskey. And certainly there are some dramatic differences in vegetation. So if you go further afield and really, push out into different climates of the world, I think you've got, if you like, real terroir. And certainly some of the whiskies I've tasted from around the world are quite interesting and quite different.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, am I sitting on the fence? I suppose I am in some ways, but in terms of a peatland scientist, without doubt, you can start off with different potential flavor profiles. But what happens when you, like I say, the whiskey makers get hold of it?
I want to go back. You mentioned this ban on peat sales that we're seeing predominantly in horticulture with garden centres, and I think that kind of sparked a lot of discussions within the Scotch whisky industry, right? Is it and that kind of led down the road of, are we going to have it banned within the industry? Now, you speak to the Scotch Whisky Association, they assure us that won't happen, which I kind of don't really agree with. I think that might be a little bit short-sighted. But I think the interesting thing that your book touches on is there's instances within the whiskey world where experiments have been done which didn't have to use peat. I thought that was really interesting. There's a lot of that I didn't actually know about. Can you talk about these a little bit? And do you think any of those would actually work within whiskey, knowing what you know about peat and whiskey at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of experimentation going on now, Mitch, particularly by the SWRI, Scottish Whisky Research Institute, looking at optimization of peat use, which is really, if you walk past a maltings and you can smell peat smoke, I instantly think that's a waste. That should be, being absorbed by the malted barley. But in the past, people have also talked about using different types of smoke, but that's an issue for the rules and regulations at the SWA. I think the rules and regs say that you can't use anything to replicate or replace peat smoke. But maybe that will change, and I think there are a lot of particularly new distilleries that would like to kind of push the boundaries and do something different. And it's not a hindrance to whiskey makers around the world who are producing smoky whiskey not using peat, using manuka wood and things like that. It's quite a common one in New Zealand. But nowadays, I mean, a tasting panel looking at or different peat smoke flavors will be presented with cresols and guaiacols and these various phenolic compounds, and they will train their nose associated with them. So these compounds are available from laboratory suppliers. So in theory, you could construct some sort of, concoction, for want of a better word, that could be used to replace peat smoke. And these are chemicals that are extracted from plants, from insects, for example, which are now widely available, from laboratory suppliers. So, you could, in theory, produce some sort of essence, but I mean, that wouldn't look great, would it, in terms of marketing Scotch whisky and its unique relationship? And I came across this amazing record of a distillery in Edinburgh that was making a peat essence and actually adding it to, somewhat tasteless lowland whiskey and then flogging it off as Highland whiskey, because you get a much greater premium and the flavors were much better. So there are, incidences in the past of doing that. But I think it's about the rule makers, to be honest. But as I said, I know there are distilleries in the UK who would like to do things a little bit differently.
I suppose as someone who looks at the environmental aspect of peat bogs, but also loves Scotch whisky, you must be a little bit torn. So I'm going to ask you this question. It's probably going to be a tricky one for you. Would you like to see the SWA ban peat use within Scotch whisky?
No, that's not a tricky question at all. I mean, I think the SWA is now, over the years, it's fronting up the peat issue at last. I think there was a document published this summer called the Commitment to Responsible Peat Use. And that really is a kind of, I would call it a placeholder. So it's basically saying to the Scottish government, which is where the ban would come from, this is our approach to it. This is going forward what we're planning to do. And this I think one of the issues, Mitch, has been the supply chain. So you've got the peat producers, you've got the big maltings, and you've got the whiskey makers. And bringing those three people together is, I think, vital to come up with a solution. And I think in the book, I'm quite optimistic about the future of peat use, because quite simply, around 80% of our peatlands are damaged in some way. So they are ripe for restoration. And I've worked a lot on restoration science, and the science has moved on quite incredibly over the last 10 to 20 years. Now, we know we can bring a bog back that's been damaged in all sorts of ways. We're not necessarily talking about extraction here at all, to full ecological function in quite a short period of time. So the opportunities for the Scotch whisky industry to buy into restoration, and one or two companies are doing this already, Beam Suntory particularly, the opportunities to do that are huge. And so, rather than just, if peat was banned from use by the Scotch whisky industry, well, one, what's going to happen? They'll get the peat from somewhere else, and the Scotch whisky industry would walk away from it. So, as I said, I mean, there's huge potential, I think, and huge potential in terms of a company's profile or the industry's profile to do something really good here. And peatland restoration is not rocket science. I mean, basically, you're talking about blocking up these drains that gradually dry a peat out over time and bringing the water table up. And as soon as you do that, the vegetation will come back and the peat will regrow. So the fact that so much of our peatlands are damaged means that it's ripe for restoration. And, a lot of the science now is working quite closely with landowners and land practitioners. And I think it's in a very good place. So my hope is that the whiskey industry will embrace peatland restoration. And, the amount of peat you need to restore, if you look at individual peatlands, is not great compared to the amount that might be used on an annual basis. So lock up more carbon each year using restoration than you would actually use in whiskey making.
And that's what I liked about the book, Mike, is you left it on a very high note in that, you know, you saw the positives going forward with regards to this relationship of Peat and Whisky, which you've just said as well. So I think that's great to hear. So let me ask you this: now that you've dipped your quill into the world of whiskey literature, doing your first, I know you've done chapters and you've written papers before, but I know this is your first book. Any plans for any other books? Maybe mezcal, for example, going into like that part of things, or?
Yeah, Mexico. Yeah, I'll have to speak to Steph Holt about that, wouldn't I? Yeah. I mean, mezcal fascinates me as another spirit. First of all, the straight answer to your question is I have got plans, but you know, I'm gonna enjoy the ride with the book. I'm gonna, you know, embrace it as much as I can by talking to folk like yourself. And I was quite busy initially, and there's a few, you know, events are planned for next year. You maybe outside the UK. The book was released just 3 months ago. It's due for release in North America in the autumn. So there's going to be quite a lot around that. So I just want to embrace my first book, Mitch, and you know, see what happens. I mean, you learn a lot from writing a book, and there's a lot of commitment there. So maybe it's going to be a bit like the difficult second album in music. You know, that first amazing album. It's like everybody says, like, you know, the second one, nah. But
second ones are usually like, I don't know. The second ones are usually really good though, so I'm looking forward to the second one when that comes out, whenever that happens. I was going to ask you that question. How did you find, you know, that transition from moving from writing academic papers to this? I mean, when you read this book, it isn't just about facts and figures. It talks a lot about your journey through whiskey, and especially, you know, walking in the peatlands. And I love that you went out there with your brother, I think it was, and did all those treks
across the flow country.
Yeah. And so I mean, it's quite different, like bringing that sort of personal aspect of your life into this book, as well as just writing on the facts and figures of Peat, right? And everything else.
I mean, that's right. I mean, it's quite a major transition. It's writing academic text is quite formulaic. You know, we have when we write a scientific paper, we have an abstract, an introduction, methods, materials, all this kind of thing. And of course, you know, writing popular science is completely different. And at early days, I realized I necessarily didn't have the tools to do this. So I went back to university. I did a creative writing course, evening class at University of Edinburgh for non-fiction, which was absolutely wonderful. I loved it. You know, basically throw all those rules of grammar that you learned at school out the window, and you know, just you know, write and discover your voice. That's what writers talk about, discovering your voice. So I wanted to enjoy writing this book. You know, I've stepped away from my day job in the academic world. I wanted to enjoy this. So it is part, you know, it's got all the things I enjoy in life, you know, travelogue. It's got personal memoir, it's got history, it's got talking and meeting with people. You know, even our dog makes a few cameo appearances in the book, you know. So it's a very, you know, it's a different whiskey book, I think you would agree. And it's one that it is very much a journey. And but one of the challenges, I think, for a scientist is to get your science across to a popular audience. And to be honest, the hardest chapter to write was the story of a piece of peat, which is the first chapter. So that's the more sciencey chapter, but I kind of dripped the science in throughout the book. But communicating that, surprisingly, is more challenging, just because you're so steeped in, you know, the science of it. You've got to step back, and, you know, having people to read it and comment on it. I had some, you know, people like Billy Abbott, you know, read a couple of chapters and gave me good feedback. So, you know, it was, you know, it's been greeted, you know, well by the whiskey world.
No, it's great.
It is very much my own kind of personal journey.
And congratulations again on it, Mike. It is fantastic. You know, anyone listening, Peat and Whisky, the Unbreakable Bond, go out, get yourself a copy right now. You know, when someone like Charlie McLean, my good friend, and obviously I take it you know him quite well, but, you know, just to read what he wrote about this, I believe this to be among the most important books about whiskey ever written. Wow. That's a nice quote from Charlie, right?
Yeah, when I read that from Charlie, I basically fell off my seat.
Final questions for you, Mike, before we shoot off here. Favorite peated whiskey?
Kalila. That's where my journey started. And, you know, I default to Kalila regularly. I love that peat sweet flavor, and it's something that also I think is close to modern Torrevieja. I love that style of whiskey. It's not always peated. I really enjoy the lighter or the unpeated kind of whiskies from up in the northeast of Scotland. Clean Leash, Old Imperial, Scapa, those kind of things.
What was your favorite experience from writing this book?
Going to Lewis. One of the stories I tell in the book is about this famous smoke plant on the bogs of Lewis, which was used by the old famous Shivers plant, which used to make some experimental whiskies that your good friend Alan Winchester helped me uncover. And to go to Lewis and see the remnants of it and to visit it was quite something. Nobody had ever tried anything as crazy as that before, to be brutally honest.
Yeah.
Taking peaty lock water, putting it through a smoke plant, enhancing the peaty flavor, putting it into barrels, bringing it around in fishing boats to the ports of Bucky, and taking it to Glenkeith Distillery. That was amazing. That
blew my mind.
Yeah, it's a whiskey that's sits there in has a bit of a mythical status, and there's a lot written about it. But actually to go back and uncover that and talk to people that I met someone who actually worked there. Incredible.
Yeah. What was the thing you found out about Scotch whiskey on doing the research and interviewing people that you didn't know before? Was there anything in particular that blew your mind?
Yeah, I think a number of things. There are a number of things, but I was amazed by the role of Edy, the island of Edy in Orkney, which I write about and call the Peat Isle. How important that single island was for the whiskey industry, over a long period of time. It had the same level of importance as St Fergus Moss does now in terms of Aberdeenshire for the whiskey industry. So that was quite amazing.
You actually went over that. The story that you tell on how you have to get over there, and you actually camp overnight as well. You go pretty hardcore with some of the stuff in here, Mike.
Well, I don't do so much camping as I used to, but I absolutely kind of love that sort of stuff as well. And and the discovery of the Bunnahabhain Peat books was in the archives of the University of Glasgow was also quite special as well, because there you have records of basically every single person, what they did, over the whole, from about the 1880s up to 1960 something, the whole Bunnahabhain Peat period. Every single person, their name, what they did, what they were paid, the time when they started getting workers' insurance, the periods when people went to war. You get that whole social sort of dimension, and that's one of the things I love about the book, Mitch, or love researching the book, and also love about the whiskey industry, is this relationship to landscape and people. Dave Broom writes about this, of course, but it's much more than whiskey. It's about communities and the past and the future, I think.
Thank you so much for jumping on. Congratulations again, and hopefully next time we can chat about your book or your second book over a couple of drams.
Yeah, it'd be great. Absolutely. Yeah, and thanks for the invitation, Mitch. Great to talk to you.
Mitch, that was a super in-depth look at what's going on with the world of peat. Really interesting, super geeky in the best way, right? It's like, in order to understand, it's such a complex just a topic anyway. So for us, I thought you guys did a cracking job kind of covering all the main aspects of that. And yeah, what were yourself? What were your thoughts? Now having heard it back, are you just listening to it going like, God, is that what I sound like? Man, my voice is so annoying. Or what did you take out of that interview?
No, it's cool sitting down with Mike, man. Really nice guy.
Seems like good dude. Yeah.
And just really happy for him in that he went out and managed to do that book and write it. Like we said in the interview, that was his first time writing a book, so it was a big deal for him. And I think he did a really good job. Yep. It's not an easy task writing a book. And I kind of know that because I might be dabbling on writing my own book right now, Nicholas.
In crayon? Oh,
crayon,
man,
yeah.
That's so good. I feel good for
Matchstick
you.
man.
Good for you, laddie. I know you are. I'm looking forward to getting a read of this. So,
and one of the things that Mike told me as well is that's the first copy already sold out. So he's on to his second copy. It's coming over to North America shortly, Nicholas. So all the listeners
available on Amazon.
I'm assuming it'll be on Amazon. Yeah. I went old school and bought the paperback version of it. So quite nice to. I don't know. What do you read books on Kindles, or do you read them like hardcore
I
normal
only
books?
buy books, regular books. I don't actually read books on a Kindle or anything
Yeah.
at all.
I think it's good for traveling, but I think, it's quite nice to actually have a proper book in front of you.
Well, more than that, and usually, unless it's like I never have a huge catalog of books, mainly because when I read a book, I actually pass it on to somebody. Usually, if I'm like, this is a good read, it happened. Funny enough, I was just telling this story. This started because when I left university, I was in Spain, just like getting away from it all, and some guy just came up to me on a beach, like some older dude who was like in his 60s, and he was like, you should read this book, it's fantastic, and just handed me a Harlan Coben crime novel. And then I read every Harlan Coben book, and I was telling somebody the reason I really enjoy Harlan Coben crime fiction is because that moment, and I was like, this is so cool. And he just like pass it on once you're done reading it, and that's what I started to do. So every time I read a really good book like that, I'll pass it on. When I buy like a whiskey book or something that's a bit more something like that I would keep and use as a tool to go back to and reference. Yeah, exactly. I hold on to things like that. But every other book that I've, like novel wise, I've kind of read and passed on. So, but you actually bought a physical book that you had to turn the pages, and did you have one of those little sponges to wet your finger so you could turn the page and not have to lick your finger?
Well, like I referenced in the interview, mate, I don't think you'll like it because it's not got that many pictures for you. So you'd be screwed.
Well, I know. I heard that. All right, guys. Well, thanks very much for tuning into that amazing episode. Mitch, thanks for conducting that interview. As always, you are a champion for our industry. It was a really great, and thanks to Mike as well for coming on and giving us such insight into the world of peat. And for those of you out there, be sure to check out his book online and get a copy of it delivered. A real book. You can get it on Kindle, but get a real book just for fun and then pass it on to someone else.
But again, guys, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.